if we had to pick 10 things that are great about humanity, there would probably be several Beethoven works amongst them.
Where does Beethoven rank in the history of Western music? And I suppose there I would say Beethoven is one of the gods.
It's been famously said that, in a sense, he's defined what music means, what music is.
I would definitely say that Beethoven is the greatest composer who ever lived.
His music is so firmly rooted in everything human, with all of its frailties and weaknesses and shortcomings. He's perceived often as a misanthropic character, but his music is also the music of an inveterate optimist, of someone who never gives up in thinking that men can be better.
Winter, 1825. At his home in Vienna, the world's greatest composer is writing what will be one of his last works, his opus number 133. Some call it incomprehensible, the work of a lunatic. Others acclaim yet another masterpiece in an extraordinary life. A life that begins in obscurity here beside the Rhine in the German town of Bonn. In the middle of December 1770, in a top-floor bedroom, Bonn gained a new inhabitant. Ludwig van Beethoven was the first child to survive infancy of Johann and Maria van Beethoven. Little is known of his parents. No portraits exist. It seems his mother was mild-mannered, while his father was stern. Both Johann and his father before him were court musicians. The same path was laid out for Ludwig. At age 7, he gave his first public concert. His father taught him at first, then saw the need to employ more skilled teachers.
One of Beethoven's teachers in Bonn was Christian Gottlob Neeve. If I take a little bit from a sonata, this is probably the sort of music that Beethoven had to learn as a student.
Neefe, who was court organist, made his promising student his assistant. The young boy played this keyboard for hours on end, and at 13 wrote a piano concerto.
It's extremely virtuoso. There's almost too much piano in it. The piano just goes up and down in thirds, in octaves. This is typically a piece where he was showing off his pianistic abilities. If I just concentrate on playing, I can do it. It's almost unpleasant to play. It's amazing that he could write it, but it's much more amazing that he could play it.
Beethoven, like Mozart, as a boy, would be able to sit down and improvise. His friends would no doubt say, you know, play us a love song, and he would make up a love song. Play us a battle, he would write a battle. Play us a storm, he would write a storm. I think I'll use that later in my Symphony No. 6.
Bonn was a rather cultivated place. Successive electors of Bonn had encouraged music and philosophy and various other pursuits of the time. When Beethoven was 14, a new elector arrived, Maximilian Franz, who believed in the new philosophical ideas and was also extremely musical.
Bonn's nobles took their lead from this new elector, who was both their archbishop and prince. Under his enlightened rule, musical life flourished.
Dann muss Bonn ein Ort gewesen sein, wo vieles exemplarisch sehr, sehr gut vorbereitet wurde. Diese Prägung hier als Kind vor Ort in Bonn, die ist sicherlich so erfolgt, dass er natürlich mit sehr, sehr viel, auch sehr gut gespielter Musik aufgewachsen ist.
Beethoven entstammte keiner hohen Adelsfamilie. Sein Nachname ist Van Beethoven. Sie waren ursprünglich aus Mecheln in Belgien und nicht von Beethoven. Aber er hatte das Glück, dass er einige hohe Adelsfamilien hier in Bonn zum Freunde hatte. So zum Beispiel die Familien Wegeler und von Preuning. Madame Helene von Preuning engagierte Beethoven als Klavierlehrer für ihre Kinder. Und der Kontakt mit diesen Familien hat ihm natürlich auch für sein späteres Fortkommen sehr genutzt. Denn er hat da die Sprachen gelernt, Lateinisch und Französisch. Er hat die höfische Etikette kennengelernt. Er hat die Literatur der Zeit gelesen mit seinen Freunden.
Other details of his youth are vague. What is known is that Beethoven secured a post playing viola in the court orchestra, performing works by the two greatest composers of the age. The first was Wolfgang Mozart, born in Salzburg but now living in Vienna. In his short lifetime, Mozart composed over 650 works, including 27 piano concertos and 41 orchestral symphonies. The second was Joseph Haydn, also in Vienna and just as prolific as Mozart. These were the giants Beethoven looked up to.
By his mid-teens, Beethoven was considered to be a prodigy of potentially Mozartian proportions. And the next step for a young musician in his situation would have been to travel to the center of German musical culture, that is Vienna, to meet with and hopefully study with the best masters, in this case, Mozart himself. So in 1787, Beethoven did travel to Vienna, and legend has it that he met with Mozart, but in fact there's no evidence that he did. The historical record is in fact blank on this, and regardless, after 2 weeks, Beethoven was forced to return home to Bonn as his mother had become seriously ill.
Dear Dr. von Schiller, she died after enduring great pain and agony. Who was happier than I when I could still utter the sweet name of mother, and it was heard and answered? I am unhappy. I have been plagued with asthma and melancholia.
Beethoven's young sister died soon after, and the fortune of the family, the widowed father, Ludwig, and his two younger brothers, declined. It seems Beethoven's father took to drink. The teenaged Beethoven took it upon himself to become head of the household. In 1792, fortune favoured Beethoven. While travelling through Bonn, Haydn breakfasted in this dance hall. Beethoven introduced himself and handed him the score of a recent work. Haydn was impressed. So impressed, he offered to tutor Beethoven at his home in Vienna. The Elector granted permission for his employee, Beethoven, to leave. And in November 1792, Beethoven, aged 21, arrived once again in Vienna. Letters of introduction opened doors, and he was helped to find a room, a piano, a wig, and new clothes. Beethoven made his way around the palaces of Vienna's nobility: Lichnowsky, Razumovsky, Van Case, Van Swieten, Kinsky, Lobkowitz, with their music rooms and private orchestras. Beethoven could not have been in a better place at a better time.
There is this idea in the air among those connoisseurs who had heard Beethoven and followed his progress so far that this might be the next really big person He was dressed well, looked quite striking. He seems to have been, in some ways, a quite fashionable figure. He even briefly owned a horse, though he characteristically forgot to feed it. He was also brusque, rude, forthright, an impatient young man.
By night, he lived it up in Vienna, but by day, he studied hard with Haydn.
At some point during his tuition, Beethoven complained to Haydn that he was not getting enough money from the Elector to support himself in Vienna, and he undoubtedly was looking to have more time and trying not to return to Bonn. So Haydn took it upon himself to write to the Elector, enclosing some pieces Beethoven had given him, and suggesting that certainly Beethoven have a higher stipend. Haydn was shocked when he received a letter back from the Elector in Bonn, saying essentially that not only had Beethoven misrepresented the amount of money he was getting, but also that the compositions that Beethoven had given Haydn were not new ones. What Beethoven had done was a little bit of a con game. He behaved to some extent like a scam artist. The upshot of this episode was that the Elector wrote to Haydn and said, perhaps it's time for Herr Beethoven to come home.
Beethoven never had to make that trip home. News came that a French army had reached Bonn and forced the Elector to flee. Beethoven could try and establish himself as an independent musician.
Up to Beethoven's time, composers were primarily expected to fulfill the demands of their employees and to write the expected sort of music for church services or court balls or whatever it would be. By the late 18th century, the old system is beginning to break down.
Audiences were wider, less just inside the court, and music was being sold wider, and it was being written for everybody.
In early 1795, at a charity concert for the widows and orphans of musicians, Beethoven had the chance to show off before a wider audience at the popular Burgtheater. The piece was one of his own piano concertos.
Mozart had shown the way. The piano concertos were for showing off Mozart. Beethoven knew the Mozart piano concertos. I think he thought at that stage that that's what he would be, a composer, pianist, but very much a pianist for the rest of his life. He would certainly have wanted to show his dexterity, his skill, his brilliance at the keyboard. But as a budding composer, of course, he also wanted to show what marvelous musical ideas he had.
I think with any work of Beethoven, it's the force of his personality which is so strong. Simultaneously in this piece, you feel this tremendous admiration and respect for the greatest composers of the past, and you feel his own personality asserting itself.
Nowadays, composers somehow aren't supposed to imitate other people, you know, they've got to be originality. In the old days it wasn't like that at all. I mean, Bach imitated people, Handel borrowed ideas, Mozart borrowed ideas, Haydn borrowed ideas. You learn from your parents, you learn from your teachers. You imitate their style for a bit and then you go your own way. Beethoven unashamedly wanted to be as good as Haydn and Mozart, and then when he found he wanted to be better.
Vienna, June, 1794. To Eleanor von Breuning, Bonn. The piano variations I have written will be rather difficult to play. I resolved to embarrass those Viennese pianists, some of whom pass my style off as their own, and are thus my sworn enemies. I wanted to take revenge, because I knew they'll try to play these new pieces, and that they'd struggle.
Sometimes you get a vivid snapshot, I mean the famous snapshot of him being asked in a drawing room to play something, play something please Herr Beethoven, in Vienna when he was younger, and he didn't really want to do it, but he sat down at the keyboard, opened the lid and waited for a moment, and then he was supposed to put all his arms on all the keys and went, "Ah! That's my piece for this evening," and got up and left.
Se si può fare una classifica di compositori più bevitori della storia, Beethoven ha sicuramente un posto importante in questa classifica, oltre che come compositore in sé. Quasi tutti i giorni lui andava fuori a mangiare e divertente che una gran parte delle epistolarie, delle lettere, parlano per l'appunto del posto in cui si mangiava meglio, si beveva meglio, lì il vino adesso non era più tanto buono, lì il cibo stava migliorando.
Vienna, August, 1794. We're having very hot weather here, and the Viennese are afraid that soon they will not be able to get any more ice cream. For as the winter was so mild, ice is scarce. Here, various important people have been locked up. It is said that a revolution's about to break out. But I believe that so long as an Austrian can get his brown ale and his little sausages, he's not likely to revolt. If your daughters are grown up, prepare one to be my bride. Times are bad. My exchequer is completely empty, and I am driven to ask you for a loan. But my art is winning me friends and renown, and what more do I want? I'm sure I'll soon make a great deal of money.
It's really worth bearing in mind that in the 1790s, Beethoven was really the preeminent keyboard virtuoso in Vienna. I mean, he was really the #1 keyboard star. He was kind of, you know, the big name.
At 24, Beethoven's reputation gave him the stature to publish his work, beginning with his opus No. 1. The growing business of publishing paid a one-off fee to composers. These fees became Beethoven's main source of income. Hardly had Opus 1 reached Vienna's musical elite than a new publication arrived, Opus 2.
It must have created a sort of shock in Vienna. It's such passionate and new music.
So there is things are getting closer and tension is getting higher, of course. So this is a way which is totally unknown to Mozart and Haydn, who generally build their ideas on a classical, elegant symmetry. There's something, there's the answer, another thing, the answer to this other thing, a new idea, and so the music is going on like this, with this fantastic and beautiful sense of symmetry and harmony, while Beethoven goes through building tension for the listener. And most of his pieces have this kind of progression in time, in rhythm, in tension, in building up this dramatic urge.
He must have had a hand that was quite large, or at least quite capable of being spread out, because he'd write things. There's this sonata, the second sonata that he wrote, and there's a passage in it that goes like this. Which, of course, is what every pianist does in this spot. But in fact, he writes a fingering for it, he himself, and the fingering is this. So, no left hands. He would probably put his left hand in the air and see, I'm doing this on my own, you know? And it's actually, I've never seen any pianist who could possibly do this. So, of course, the standard way of performing it is just use your two hands, which he may have left out chords for the left hand just in order to let lesser pianists play this. Or this may be a great cosmic joke, that fingering, which he put in to annoy everybody else.
Beethoven continued to release bold new works in different styles and for different instruments.
That's the beginning of the allegro of this first movement. So the real movement starts, and before that we had like 3-4 minutes of slow introduction. And the slow introduction comes to this complete stop. And for a 26-year-old, it's unbelievable the arrogance this guy must have had to just freeze the time like this. And he has the pianist play these chords, ta-ta, ram, pom, pom, 2, 3, 4, and then the cello comes.
Life was good. Extra income was coming in from a lucrative sideline in piano lessons for Vienna's wealthy. His search for fame and fortune was going well. His search for a wife, less so.
I think a lot of Beethoven's sonatas were actually composed or dedicated to female, well, yeah, you could call them students of his, or ladies he admired. Beethoven was actually forever in love with all his students and all the ladies he met, and one of his ways of showing it was to write them a piano sonata. So they all had their own Beethoven sonata. These were dedicated to the Countess von Braun, wife of a British diplomat in Vienna. And Beethoven must have liked her very much, considering the cheerful music he wrote. He actually wasn't interested in writing piano sonatas at all. What he really wanted to do was write symphonies and operas. And these piano sonatas, they were highly popular. I mean, they sold well, so he felt he had to produce them to keep generating money.
Beethoven felt ready to take on Mozart and Haydn in the pinnacle of private music, string quartets.
I see the Beethoven of the Opus 18s as a man bursting with confidence in his own extraordinary abilities, completely sure that he's a genius.
At 29, Beethoven gave a first concert for his own benefit. He included works by Mozart and Haydn and premiered his first symphony.
I strongly believe the first chord of the first symphony, Beethoven's symphony, probably sounded as a shock to the audience. I'm here, yeah, I'm Ludwig van Beethoven.
The first symphony is a masterpiece. From the first pizzicato, again, the pizzicato which opens is a shower of, ah, what? And then again, pa! And then again, you see, pizzicato is so original there.
Vienna, January 1801. Dear Herr Hofmeister, I am offering to sell you a symphony. How much it's worth does not concern me, because I am really an incompetent businessman who is bad at arithmetic. There ought to be in the world a market for art, where the artist would only have to bring his works and take as much money as he needed. But, as it is, an artist has to be a businessman as well.
The quartets and the symphony were modestly received. But having sold the rights to his music, Beethoven's future earnings had to come from new work.
June 29th, 1801. Dear friend, my compositions bring me in a good deal. I am offered more commissions than it is possible for me to carry out. But my wretched health has put a nasty spoke in my wheel. My ears hum and buzz day and night. I lead a miserable life. For almost 2 years I have ceased to attend any social functions just because I find it impossible to say to people, I am deaf. In my profession it is a terrible handicap. At a distance I cannot hear the high notes of instruments or voices. November 16th, 1801. Dear friend, for the last few months Dr. Vering has made me apply to both arms a certain kind of bark. It is an extremely unpleasant treatment. However, I am now leading a slightly more pleasant life, brought about by a dear, charming girl who loves me and whom I love. For the first time, I feel that marriage might bring me happiness. Unfortunately, I am not of her class.
The dear, charming girl was probably a pupil, the teenage Countess Giulietta Guicciardi. To her, he dedicated his Opus 27, No. 2, later called the Moonlight Sonata. Giulietta's parents, it seems, would not allow her to marry a mere piano teacher.
Beethoven sat down at some point and thought, I'll start a sonata differently. I won't just have a fast movement at the beginning, I'll have a slow, completely introvert movement that has a very, very extremely simple tune on it. And one that's endlessly sad.
Frequent sickness and declining hearing, allied with a deep love of the countryside, spurred him to leave Vienna each summer for the rural peace and thermal spas that lay just beyond the city walls. In 1802, he came to the village of Heiligenstadt.
It's in this very room that he wrote his so-called Heiligenstädter Testament, which was a letter of utter desperation, suicidal. Beethoven was having a mental breakdown. He was thinking of killing himself.
Ever since my childhood, my heart and soul have been imbued with a tender feeling of goodwill. But just think, for the last few years I've been inflicted with an incurable complaint. Though endowed with a passionate and lively temperament, I was soon obliged to seclude myself and live in solitude. I could not bring myself to say to people, "Speak up! Shout! I am deaf!" My misfortune pains me doubly, inasmuch as it leads to my being misjudged. I must live like an outcast. How humiliated I have felt. If somebody heard a shepherd sing, I heard nothing. Such experiences almost made me despair, and I was on the point of putting an end to my life. The only thing that held me back was my art. For indeed it seemed to me impossible to leave this world before I had produced all the works that I had felt the urge to compose. And thus I have dragged on this miserable existence. Almighty God, who look down into my innermost soul, you see into my heart, and you know that it is filled with love for humanity and a desire to do good.
From the pit of despair, Beethoven emerged more defiant. God had given him a rare talent. He wasn't going to waste it.
The Kreutzer Sonata, for me, I find one of the greatest sonatas that he wrote for violin and piano. It's a huge piece. It's maybe a piece where he tries to find extremes also. It's incredible tension. I think from all the 10 violin sonatas, I mean sonatas for piano and violin, it is for me definitely the wildest one and technically also the most demanding one. Oh, it's very onstuimig is the Dutch word, which maybe also marks that period in his life. I don't know, there's so much almost brewing there and boiling.
It's incredibly dramatic. The orchestral tutti is long, the piano plays very melancholy, unbelievably varied music. Stylistically speaking, the beginning of the 19th century and the composition of the C minor piano concerto of Beethoven represents an unbelievable watershed, a kind of massive break with tradition.
That's the divide. That's the kind of the earthquake movement. You know, the earth moves between two areas. Suddenly, one is thrust into the air and the other goes down. That's the Beethoven. That's the Beethoven experience. That's the extraordinary new creativity, new explosive force that Beethoven brings to the world. Not in the first and second piano concertos, but in the third, and particularly in the third symphony, of course, which is wild. Immensely ambitious, a monster.
Fundamental to the greatness of his art. The degree to which every single work is different from every other. It has been said often about Beethoven that every work inhabits a sound world of its own. And yet he could write a 50-minute work all in that one sound world is perhaps fundamental to his greatness.
I've always been considering this symphony very complex, probably too complex for me to approach. But when I studied very carefully, I just took a serious amount of time, I learned it, I discovered such a power in composing and such a precision in saying, in writing what he wanted to say. So to find the right words, the right notes to say what he wanted, what he meant. And now, today I'm here, I'm considering at least the first movement of Eroica as the best written first movement of any symphony. Is so masterly written. The power of Marcia Funebre, the Trauer March, is incredible, is so deep, is so moving. Even when comes the midsection with this fugato, this fuga, and when the energy is just growing, till a limit probably before Beethoven no one could achieve.
Beethoven's Third Symphony is significant not only musically, but historically. Beethoven was inspired by the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, and by the rise of a fellow genius. Napoleon Bonaparte had crushed the Austrians in battle, but an uneasy truce now reigned. Beethoven could safely name his new symphony Bonaparte.
Beethoven may well have felt, as did a lot of people at the time, that this military conquest was not primarily military, but primarily a philosophical and political, a social revolution, and that the result would be not the Viennese finding themselves under the thumb of another dictator, but the Viennese being set free to pursue enlightened goals.
Interesting question whether Beethoven would have written such explosive music as he sometimes did without the prompting from world events at the time. Beethoven was intensely interested in the events in Paris in 1789. He knew people at the French embassy in Vienna and heard a lot about what was going on in Paris. He was very excited by the idea of a new world, new world order, brotherhood of man, getting rid of the bad parts of the old aristocratic world, which of course he still lived. But when Napoleon became a dictator and crowned himself, he was horrified.
This is the famous score of the Eroica Symphony, in which Beethoven furiously scratched out, you can see the hole in the paper, the word Bonaparte, to whom the symphony was originally dedicated. And when Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor, Beethoven decided he would have no more to do with him.
On its premiere in 1805, he'd renamed it Eroica, the Heroic Symphony.
If somebody mentioned Napoleon, he would say, well, he may be the ruler of the world, but mine is the empire of the mind.
This is one of the most important developments in the history of music, in a sense, the ascent of instrumental music to this peak of artistic expression. And Beethoven is both caught up in that changing view of instrumental music, and is also, I think, largely part of the cause of it. It was very much his orchestral music, the music that really changed the way that people thought about instrumental music and what it was saying, and the kind of access that it could give us to the transcendental, to the infinite.
Aged 33, Beethoven was established as Vienna's foremost composer and pianist, but he continued to experiment.
can see he's doing things that he was particularly good at, I think. He was very good at, obviously, repeated notes, things like this. He was good at that, because there's a lot of that in his music. He was good at things like, at the end of this piece, nobody had ever written stuff like this. This is, well, actually, I can't really play it, quite honestly. But if you put the pedal down, get a nice piano, hope for the best, it makes an amazing effect. And the idea of playing these octaves with that rapidity and just gliding down the piano is something that Beethoven invented, actually. Probably for two reasons. One, because he could do it, and two, to annoy everybody else who couldn't. I do know that he was very instrumental in the piano becoming a bigger, more powerful, and more flexible instrument. Because he was always writing to the piano makers to make pianos bigger, stronger, louder.
By 1804, Beethoven was comfortable enough to move to a new apartment on the edge of the city. Here he would write 3 symphonies, an opera, a violin concerto, string quartets, and put the finishing touches to a triple concerto for piano, violin and cello.
Beethoven was an incredibly difficult tenant. He had no idea about keeping a place tidy, lived in chaos. He loved the views. There's a great view looking out the Vienna woods from the window over there. But on this side, there's no windows. And so I have a quotation here from Ferdinand Ries. His main room was the last one on the far wall. The adjoining house was only 2 stories high at that time, so that if there were a window on that wall, Beethoven thought, the room would be a corner room with a clear view. So you can just picture the whole scene of Beethoven secretly gets the stonemason in, starts chiseling a hole in the wall. Herr Pasqualati, the landlord, runs up the stairs, confrontation. Beethoven can't understand what the problem's about, threatens to move out. Beethoven had a habit when composing of beating in time with the stick on the floor. You can imagine the apartment below was being rented. And, for instance, composing, sitting at the piano, gets very hot one evening, takes a bucket of water, pours it over his head. Of course, the water runs down into the apartment below, which is being rented. Poor Herr Pasqualati, the landlord, then comes running up the stairs again, another confrontation. So this is what you had to put up with Beethoven as a tenant.
Beethoven's love life had heated up too, this time with a young widow.
For a long period, my deafness has made me despair of ever achieving any happiness during my life on this earth. But now things are no longer so bad. Oh, beloved Josephine, it is no desire for the other sex that draws me to you. No, it is just you, your whole self with all your individual qualities. You have conquered me. I love you as dearly as you do not love me. You were so very sad yesterday, dear Josephine. Am I really unable to influence you? Although you have so great an influence on me and make me so happy? To the publishers Breitkopf and Hertel Leipzig. Sirs, the fee for my work is much lower than what I usually accept. Send me back the manuscripts. I cannot and will not accept a lower fee. Dear Mayor, the copyist should immediately ink over what I have entered in red pencil. I cannot come myself, as I have been suffering from my usual complaint, colic pains.
While Beethoven was struggling with these personal and professional affairs, he wrestled with the ultimate creative challenge: music, words and drama together. Opera. In 1803 he was given a story by Emanuel Schikaneder at the Theater an der Wien, who had commissioned Mozart's Magic Flute. The tale of an imprisoned man rescued from darkness by a loyal wife, and of love and liberty in general, naturally appealed to Beethoven. By 1805, the opera was ready.
Ich denke, Fidelio ist eine ganz, ganz einfache Geschichte. Es ist eine sogenannte Rettungsgeschichte. Eine Frau ist verzweifelt, ihr Mann ist im Gefängnis, sie will ihn befreien, sie geht in das Gefängnis und verbirgt sich 2 Jahre hinter einer anderen Identität, hinter der Identität eines Mannes. Es gelingt ihr, den Mann zu finden, es gelingt ihr, den Mann zu befreien. Sie besiegt das Böse, den Bösen, Pizarro, den Antagonisten, und am Ende gewinnt nicht nur sie, sondern auch die ganze Welt. Alles löst sich in Jubel, Freude und Freiheit aus.
In Beethoven, especially as Pizarro, you find difficulties, because here Beethoven makes you sing, I call it canto esplosivo, because the character, this evil nature who enters on scene, he doesn't sing lines or arias, it is a pure emotional eruption. Ich denke, auch diese Verzweiflung, die dieser Komponist innerlich gefühlt hat, ist dann auch vielleicht Ausdruck dieser Kompromisslosigkeit. Es ist ihm völlig egal, ob man es singen kann oder nicht. So musste die Arie jetzt sein.
He was incredibly positive on some level. He was someone who believed in hope. He writes actually unbelievably hopeful music. Maybe in his music, at least, this is not biographical at all, in his music was maybe less concerned with human beings in the flesh and more concerned with humanity as an idea.
Beethoven war voller Widersprüche. Er war ein unerträglicher Mensch. Er wurde geschildert als eine schwärzliche Gestalt mit einem schwärzlichen Charakter. Er war Choleriker. Er hat Menschenansammlungen gehasst. Es gibt nicht eine einzige interessante Liebesbeziehung, über die man sprechen kann. Und vor allem Beethoven war krank. Der Mann war sein ganzes Leben lang krank. Und natürlich wünscht sich ein kranker Mann, der darunter leidet, dass er krank ist, nichts sehnlicher als gesund zu sein. Für mich ist das selbstverständlich, dass die einzige Oper, an der er auch noch dazu 10 Jahre gesessen hat, ein Traum, ein Ideal ist. Ein Mann wünscht sich gesund zu sein und er wünscht sich, dass die Welt gesund ist.
The idea that love is greater than injustice, than tyranny, this is so deeply felt by him. The conception of love that we in our time, who are bombarded by trash, by video clips, by YouTube, everybody can put his trash in it. It is so awful what our times, our informal times, where we all can do whatever we like, where there is no value any longer, go into modern art museums, you see trash, they write a book next to it, and they explain you don't see trash, it is holy art. And this is all so little and so in comparison to the greatness of this feelings, of the pureness of the feelings that Beethoven composed there, that I think it is unique, but it's because he felt it.
Ganz klar ist, hat Beethoven ein Propagandastück ausgewählt. Eine Apotheose an die Freiheit, eine Glücksfantasie, ein Traum. Eigentlich ist diese Oper ein Traum. Und diese Illusion, die man sich von dem Fortschritt der Menschheit, der immer fortschreitenden Glücksverheißung macht. Diese Illusion ist heute natürlich ganz, ganz schwer nachzuvollziehen und zu glauben. Aber es geht von der Intention Beethovens natürlich um diese Vorstellung eines Mannes, wie bringe ich die große Hoffnung, die zur damaligen Zeit die französische Revolution getragen hat, wie bringe ich diese Hoffnung zum Ausdruck, dass alles schön und alles gut und alles besser wird.
He'd spent a year and a half writing this. Lots of revisions, lots of changes, lots of rehearsals were needed. It was far too difficult for the performers. And then, just a week before it was due to be scheduled, at last the French invaded Vienna, and that meant that there was hardly anybody in the audience.
French military people in uniform, they were the ones who could get in and who bought the tickets. This hymn to liberation and freedom was performed to an invading, repressive army.
The timing could not have been worse. After 3 shows, the opera closed. But Beethoven was discontented with it and continued to rework Fidelio for a decade. He never managed to complete another opera. But from adversity, creativity, the hallmark of a great artist.
With the Fourth Symphony, we return to a much simpler world. But he begins with a wonderful joke. He starts with a very slow, dark, minor movement, as if it's going to be another brooding piece like the Eroica.
suddenly when comes the allegro. It's just like to open a bottle of champagne.
The Symphony No. 4 explodes from this darkness, and then you have a perfect example of uneasy joy, desire of joy.
It always bursts into laughter, as if it's laughing at us for taking all that so seriously. This humour in Beethoven is terribly important.
My dear friend, thank you for the wine. Whenever I and my friends drink it, we toast your health as we get drunk. Oh, have you heard about Fat Schuppenzai? He's got married to someone as fat as he is. Can you picture what their offspring will be like?
I tend to think of this piece as being an amazing love story, and little question mark, the insecurity that you experience performing this piece as well. I think it's part of the idea, part of the character of this concerto. You can see that this is not somebody having a comfortable life. This is somebody that is in a constant struggle. I see somebody very profound, somebody very unlucky, but somebody who has so much love to give.
Beethoven als Ausnahmepianist und als Ausnahmekomponist in Wien zu diesen Zeiten hatte nicht die Möglichkeit, die Frauen, in die er sich verliebte, die er für sich begehrte, an diese letztendlich heranzukommen, denn er hätte auch seinen Stand überwinden müssen, und er hat sich eben immer Menschen, Frauen ausgesucht, die aus der Adelsschicht stammten, und diesen Sprung zu überwinden, also diese Schicht sozusagen zu überwinden, aufzusteigen, das war nicht möglich. Ja.
compositions pouring out of him in different mediums. It's almost as if life is becoming so impossible for him that his life is becoming that of a composer. I mean, that's where he does his living. He was actually able to not only compose wonderful new pieces as a deaf man, but introduce completely new styles and sonorities purely through his oral imagination. But even before people knew he was getting deaf, they considered the Razumovsky quartets to be quite mad.
Beethoven's growing deafness and his awareness of his growing deafness caused him to react differently to the world around him. It would have affected his social interaction. It would have prevented him from pursuing all of the kind of social contacts that he wanted to, or in the ways that he wanted to. It would have affected his perception of himself, to think that as a composer, as a musician, he had the one affliction that people would be, most shocked to learn. I think that Beethoven really would have had to come to grips with his own self-image to some extent. And that's why, in a sense, it is extraordinarily heroic for all to talk about suicide, which, of course, is, I think, genuine. It is a heroic act to come to grips with, a disability that is profoundly tied up with one's self-image and the image of the world of Beethoven.
The full range of emotions must be allowed to go on in his mind, and if he goes a bit towards the extremes in his handling of other people, I think that for great geniuses like Beethoven, I think that is forgiven.
What kind of person one might have met if one had had the good or bad fortune to meet Beethoven. It might have been pretty scary. What was it? Somebody said when Rossini met Beethoven, the butterfly met the lion. I think one might have felt a bit like a butterfly in Beethoven's presence.
The caricature of Beethoven, wild, hair everywhere, it implies a lack of control and a lack of serious, organized thought, and that is the antithesis of Beethoven. He was absolutely all about serious, organized thought. No lack of control at all. Yes, he is, if you like, full of apparently uncontrolled temperament and anger, but there is also the opposite, the immensely sensitive and kind and generous, warm-hearted and also deeply vulnerable man, which will never appear in a caricature. He's the whole range. Fundamentally, it is positive. He's not misanthropic or malevolent. He's wanting always to communicate beauty and warmth and love and hope.
September 20th, 1807. Dear beloved and only Josephine, may heaven grant me one undisturbed hour to spend with you. I do not care to put up with the refusals of your servant any longer. Is it really a fact that you do not want to see me anymore? If so, do be frank.
Beethoven spent the year 1808 hard at work preparing for an epic concert. A 4-hour extravaganza, all Beethoven.
If there is one snowing night in Vienna where I could go to a concert, this would be absolutely this famous concert. When Beethoven wanted absolutely to show to Vienna how great he was.
I think that he saw this as an opportunity at the age of 38 to finally make his mark on Viennese musical life, and perhaps even finally to overcome what he must have seen as his primary competitors in the music field, which was, surprisingly, Haydn and Mozart. But if you read contemporary music journalism, there's constant talk of our three great composers, our three great German composers, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, all in the present tense, as if the fact that Haydn was too old and feeble to compose didn't count anymore, or the fact that Mozart was dead didn't count anymore. And I think Beethoven had this chip on his shoulder. I think he'd always had a chip on his shoulder, especially with respect to Mozart. And that he saw then the concert of 1808 as an opportunity to defeat his rivals.
The theatre was full, a maelstrom of noise as the audience hurried in from the snow. Beethoven deliberately started with his quietest opening movement yet.
You have a piece like the Pastoral Symphony, which, in its own serious way, exploits these mimetic gestures that are supposed to evoke nature. So you have, the opening movement, the pastoral movement. You have a slow movement, the scene by the brook. You have a storm. It's really a tremendous amount of variety. Beethoven is saying, I'm more serious, I'm better. In every respect, it's calculated to be an overwhelming event.
After the Sixth Symphony, Beethoven sat at the piano and performed a new concerto.
Here, for the very first time in the keyboard literature, we have a piece in which the piano actually begins the entire piece. The thematic material is stated by the piano at the beginning, and you have this amazing... the first theme, which is presented by the piano alone. I mean, nothing this remarkable, nothing with this sense of revolution and volatility has ever been heard by a Viennese audience in the beginning of the 19th century, let alone the 18th century. That the piano can present such a strangely amorphous theme and then be answered by the orchestra in B major is absolutely... I mean, the degree to which that is shocking is just immeasurable by our 21st century standards. I mean, if I play a cadence which ends on the dominant of G major, and then the orchestra answers me in B major, this kind of harmonic palette, tonal palette, use of keys, modulations, completely unheard of, even by Beethoven standards, I think.
I don't think that Beethoven wanted to show the world that he was a better composer. I think what he did want to show the world was that there were a lot of these charlatan composers who were making a huge living and had enormous success with writing absolute terrible music. And Beethoven couldn't stand that. And I think that was something where he wanted to prove the world that he was on a much higher level and a far better composer, a better pianist. There is a lot of wildness, there is a lot of almost aggression, there is a lot of abundance. So I wouldn't be surprised if you look at his father. They sometimes say that his father was used to drink too much and was quite wild and aggressive, could be quite nasty. I'm sure there must have been something true of it, and it probably ended up in Beethoven as well. I mean, it runs in the family, and I think Beethoven probably had more of his father inside him than he would have liked, but that's probably what gave his music such enormous strength and power. I don't think to be a good composer you shouldn't be completely normal.
What is amazing about the works of Beethoven is how much he's always constantly sort of, digging at the material and in the material to reach deeper. And I feel often for Beethoven deeper means at the end of the day higher.
The fourth concerto is one of those heartbreaking pieces in the sense that we know that it's the last concerto that Beethoven played in public. The effect that disappointment had on Beethoven's career, his confidence, his ideas of his self-worth, I think must have been massive, the idea of Beethoven the pianist suddenly became questionable, became fraught with problems because of his deafness and his frustration with the keyboards, his frustration at being able to play the keyboards. So the Fourth Concerto is sort of that last glimpse of Beethoven's brilliance and virtuosity and revolutionary character as a pianist and composer. The Fourth Concerto was considered immensely difficult by contemporary standards at the beginning of the 19th century. It was one of those pieces, I think, that was absolutely tailor-made for Beethoven's pianistic abilities. To put oneself in the shoes of a person like that, who was really at the forefront of Viennese musical life as a virtuoso keyboard player, to suddenly be faced with the sort of end of an entire chapter in his life as a keyboard virtuoso, must have been a major, major blow.
No one guessed he would never perform a piano concerto in public again. After an intermission, the audience heard what would become the most famous notes of all time.
The opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is like to give an uppercut to the people, to the audience. It's just to da-da-da-da.
Beethoven would start, you know, da-da-da-da, and da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. We can invert that, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, we can repeat it. Mozart could write a symphony in 4 days. Beethoven could do that too. He could write very, very fast. But sometimes he wanted to work and make something grander, and he was thinking more of the future. You know, Mozart was writing for Saturday, and Beethoven was beginning to write for eternity. You know, that was one of the conversations he had with his creator. You know, he wanted to be, as it were, a great composer, I think.
I mean, if we look at the Fifth Symphony here, when he's worked himself up into a frenzy, and he's writing a fortissimo passage, and you can get notes flying all over the page, and you see tremendous displays of temperament and also in the crossings out, and great swishes of pen all over the place.
So the composing process in Beethoven is more similar to the work in progress of a sculpture, like Michelangelo. So you already have a complex idea of what the statue will be, but you have to work a lot to take all the extra marble or the extra element just to live the pure artistic product.
In the Fifth Symphony, when you get to the end of the scherzo and everything seems to be fizzling out, and then it builds up instead, and you think, what is going to happen now? You have been sitting there for nearly half an hour, and it all builds up, and quite suddenly everything thunders in.
Beethoven had thrown all the dice, but 4 hours of unfamiliar music in a freezing cold theatre was too much for his audience.
It was not a success in the sense that people probably wanted to go home. But I think it was a success in that the very fact that Beethoven could pull it off, kind of doing it is more important than having it be a success. And it is, as I say, simply so monumental that you've got to admire the man for, undertaking it.
One admirer, Napoleon's youngest brother Jerome, offered Beethoven a permanent post in the German town of Kassel. Beethoven accepted the offer, to the shock of Vienna's nobles. 3 of them, Prince Lobkowitz, a patron of the arts, Prince Kinsky, also a great patron, and the Archduke Rudolf, brother of the Emperor and a pupil of Beethoven's, changed his mind by offering him a healthy salary, just to stay in Vienna.
his music is so firmly rooted in everything human, with all of its frailties and weaknesses and shortcomings of all sorts. But at the same time, it's there's an element of Promethean struggle and of attempt to always reach higher and to never give up and never surrender. Something that always tries to elevate itself from the difficulties or the misery inherent to the human condition. That's also what's so fascinating to me, is that he's perceived often as a sort of misanthropic character, but his music is also the music of an inveterate optimist, of someone who never gives up in thinking that, you know, men can be better.
Events made it hard to be an optimist. The French were back, and unlike last time, Vienna opted to defend itself. But a short siege brought the city to its knees, followed by months of occupation.
During the bombardment of Vienna, Beethoven is said to have hidden in his brother's cellar and covered his ears with a pillow to protect his weak hearing. It was a terrible time for him. He said there's lots of cannons and gunfire and shortages of everything, and can't buy things, can't buy boots. The whole life is completely disrupted by the French.
What a destructive, disorderly life I see and hear around me. Nothing but drums, cannons, and human misery in every form. I had begun to have a little singing party at my rooms every week, but the accursed war has put a stop to everything.
All the nobility left Vienna for the countryside where they were out of harm's way. In particular, his close friend Archduke Rudolf left in May 1809, and Beethoven wrote a very heartfelt personal piano piece for Archduke Rudolf just before his departure. Lebe wohl, farewell.
The invasion of the French must have been a mighty blow. Beethoven had profoundly felt and held ideas about equality, brotherhood, the way a society, a free society, should work, and that he encouraged, people to think that way through his music.
Vienna, January the 2nd, 1810. Hardly had I recovered when my illness sent me back to bed. Is it any wonder? We no longer have even decent bread to eat. Vienna, February the 4th, 1810. We are being supplied with bad food for which we have to pay incredibly high prices. Vienna, May, 1810. I should be happy if that fiend had not settled in my ears. If I had not read that a man should not voluntarily quit this life so long as he can still perform a good deed, I would have left this earth long ago by my own hand.
One moment contemplating suicide, the next asking his assistant to help him smarten up with a new shirt and neckties. Beethoven, approaching 40, was hoping to woo another teenager to be his bride, Thérèse Malfatti. It seems he even wrote her a small piano piece, later mistakenly called For Elise.
It's funny to see how famous and well-known a small piano piece like Für Elise has become over the years. It's certainly not Beethoven's best piano work, but I think it's probably one of the few works which actually does what it was supposed to do. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be played in concert, it was supposed to be played by people at home and enjoyed by people who play it. This is typically a piece which is much more fun to play than to listen to. So if you've heard it 2 or 3 times, I mean, it starts getting a little bit irritating.
Dear friend, every day there are fresh inquiries from foreigners, new acquaintances, new circumstances. But my master, Archduke Rudolph, makes the same demand and wants me to be with him. Your Imperial Highness, I see that you want to have the effects of my music tried on horses as well. For that favour, I shall remain as long as I live your most willing servant, and the music will be brought to you at the fastest gallop.
There's a famous occasion in 1812 when he briefly met Goethe, the great German writer, one of the towering cultural figures of early German Romanticism. And they are going for a walk at the Teplitz, the spa, and the imperial party comes along. And Goethe, as a properly brought up Enlightenment 18th century man, stands aside and lets the party pass and takes off his hat. Beethoven strides straight through the middle as if indifferent to this. Beethoven had this sort of pride.
In Teplitz, Beethoven also wrote, but never sent, letters to yet another love of his life. Not a teenager this time, but, evidence would suggest, a married mother called Antonie Brentano.
Beethoven was, intensely human in the sense that he may have said that, he disapproves of an extramarital affair, or anyone who would engage or try to foster one, and yet he himself did because he fell in love.
Teplitz, July the 6th, 1812. My angel, my all. Only a few words today. Be cheerful, and be forever my faithful, my only sweetheart, my all as I am yours. However much you love me, my love for you is even greater. July the 7th, 1812. Even when I am in bed, my thoughts rush to you, my immortal beloved, now and then joyfully, then again sadly, waiting to know whether fate will hear our prayer. No other woman can ever possess my heart. Never, never. Oh, God, why must one be separated from her who is so dear? Your love has made me both the happiest and the unhappiest of mortals.
Beethoven's cash ran as short as his luck. War had crushed the Austrian currency, and his salary plummeted. But good luck followed bad. In 1813, the British General Wellington defeated the French in Spain. Beethoven accepted a lucrative commission to write a patriotic symphony. The war with France was finally over, and a congress convened in Vienna to divide the spoils. The victors held endless balls and turned to Vienna's greatest composer to entertain them with 2 new symphonies. his 7th and 8th. While Europe rejoiced, Beethoven despaired. His hearing had all but gone. On the 25th of January 1815, at a concert for the Empress of Russia, he sat at the piano to accompany a singer in one of his early compositions. It was his last known public appearance as a pianist. Beethoven's relationship with his younger brothers, both of whom had moved to Vienna, had never been easy. Then, in November 1815, his brother Caspar Karl died. Beethoven, who had always looked down on his brother's wife, sought custody of his nephew Karl. For 4 years, they fought bitterly over the young child.
Vienna, February the 6th, 1816. I have fought a battle for the purpose of wresting a poor, unhappy child from the clutches of his unworthy mother. Last night, that queen of the night was at the artist's ball until 3 a.m., exposing not only her mental, but also her bodily nakedness. It was whispered that she was willing to hire herself for 20 gulden. I have to support my little nephew entirely. Until now he has been at a boarding school. That costs up to 1,100 gulden. I have had bad luck again with another servant. He gets drunk, stays out of the house for nights on end, and is shockingly rude. My hearing has become worse. I have never been able to look after myself and my needs. I am even less able to do so now.
In the late 18-teens, Beethoven was somewhat more erratic in his behavior. He was less conscientious about his hygiene. He was less controlled, let's say, when dealing with other people, more likely to ignore etiquette and proper social behavior. He didn't compose as much, and I suspect that there were a number of reasons for this. One would have been his increasing deafness, another would have been his increasingly bad health, and the third would have been his increasingly difficult family situation, especially with respect to his nephew Karl.
These were terrible years, but not entirely without composition.
It's one of the sonatas that is perhaps the least known and the least liked. It's quite a demanding piece, also for the listener, in fact. You know, they have to really, they can't expect to just sit there passively and for something to grab them, as may be the case with, you know, Appassionata or Tempest or so many other sonatas, which have possibly more direct impact on the listener. This is very, very complex.
I used to be able to make all my other circumstances subservient to my art. I admit, however, that by doing so I became a bit crazy. My servant has been quite different since I threw those books at her head. I still have to find a new housekeeper. She must be a good cook and ought to be able to turn her hand to mending shirts. The new kitchen maid made a really wry face about carrying wood. I trust that she will remember that even our Redeemer had to drag his cross to Golgotha. I am not at all well, and for some time now I have again had to take medicine. Hence I can scarcely devote myself for a few hours a day to heaven's most precious gift to me, that is, my art. October 27th, 1819. I am to be recognized forthwith as Karl's sole guardian. Moreover, the mother is to be forbidden to associate with her son. August the 5th, 1820. I cherish the hope of being able perhaps to set foot next year on my native soil and to visit my parents' graves.
Beethoven's hearing got worse. Custom-built ear horns got bigger. Pianos were made louder. At 49, he was completely deaf. Friends could communicate only by writing.
He becomes more and more reclusive, cut off from the world by his increasing deafness and by his bitterness over the failure of his affairs with women, and in general a darkening view of the world. He obviously became very, very disorganized and shabby. On one occasion, late in his life, he was even arrested because the Viennese police thought he was a tramp, and took a lot of persuading that he was in fact the great Beethoven. Apparently, there were occasions when his friends would actually swap clothes that he'd discarded while he was sleeping and put new clothes in their place, which he'd then put on the next day without even noticing.
If you were in luck, you could catch him in a very generous and expansive mood. After all, we know he liked his wine. He liked company. He loved being at the tavern, drinking and eating. And he even made a note to himself once in his diary saying, I really must make sure that every day I seek the company of a musician in order to find out more about how the violin works, how the oboe works, how the trombone works, and that way, in company, to learn more about the instruments and about my art and about life. He was not only humble in that respect, but he was warm-hearted and wanted to have contact with people. Therefore, if you rang his doorbell, of course he was immensely temperamental. You might catch it at the wrong time and get a bucket of water in your face. But also, he might say, "Come in, my dear fellow, yes!" Of course, I invent these words as is clear. But one gets all the impressions from all the surviving documents, one of which is a most amazing document that came to light in Cornwall, of all places, in 1999. And this was a hitherto unpublished, unknown, totally unknown manuscript of a string quartet movement, which is, if I recall rightly, about 26 bars. It lasts under a minute, but is a beautifully crafted work in an unusual key, B minor, which it turned out he composed on the spot for an English visitor who called on him in Vienna in 1819. I mean, this is extraordinary.
Another thing we have to bear in mind, I think, is the contrast between the outward chaos of his daily life and the extraordinary control that he was able to exert over the details of his music. There's every truth in the kind of romantic image of Beethoven as a composer who expresses all sorts of emotions in his music, but he's also, in my view, an incredibly cerebral composer as well. The musical structures that he creates are extraordinarily complex. He's able to express or to exert in his music the kind of control over detail that clearly escaped him in daily life altogether.
Beethoven began composing what would be the last of his piano sonatas, Opus Works 110 and 111.
You can see sometimes very obsessive elements in the way he writes. For instance, in the lamenting song, the Klagender Gesang in Opus 110, when you have it for the second time in G minor, there's such specific indications that he writes. You know, even in those bars, there are so many examples of this obsession with detail. When he writes that it has to sound exhausted, it's like you're completely spent of energy, and the feeling of trying to catch your breath, and the way he actually manages to convey that in his notation is amazing. Here you have these very short phrases, which in some sense could have been a longer line. He could have written it like this. So you just feel the continuity of that line. But instead, it's as if we shouldn't even have enough breath in our lungs to carry through these relatively short phrases. So that feeling of exhaustion has to come across. It's very difficult to do.
In many of the late pieces, it's like he is becoming more and more aware of the acoustic phenomena, and which is quite remarkable for somebody who, at this stage, was totally deaf. There's a place in the Opus 110 Sonata, for example, which is just repeating this note again and again. He's repeating this note in the treble again and again and again and listening to it.
There's one part of the variation that's just in the lower bit of the piano, and one that's in the highest bit up there, and there's this abyss in between that's remaining untouched. And the little thing on the side, we don't know if he really meant it, but what happened here in the left hand is basically the theme of the Ode to Joy, which he was hiding in there. If he really meant that, it is the same time that he wrote this sonata. This piece symbolizes eternity.
While I was dozing, I dreamt that I was travelling to very distant parts of the world, even to Syria and, in fact, to India and back again, and even to Arabia. And in the end, I even got as far as Jerusalem. However glittering his fame may seem on the surface, the artist is not allowed to be Jupiter's guest in Olympus every day. Vulgar humanity too often drags him down against his will from those pure ethereal heights.
After more than 4 years in the writing, and almost as much effort in trying to sell it to Europe's royal families, Beethoven revealed his proudest achievement, his Mass, the Missa Solemnis.
My chief aim when I was composing this Mass was to awaken and permanently instill religious feeling into the listeners.
Ist das längste Werk von Beethoven, abgesehen von seiner Oper. Er wollte ein wichtiges Werk schreiben. Er wollte mit diesem Werk ein bisschen vielleicht sein Vermächtnis an die nachfolgenden Generationen geben. Beethoven war kein praktizierender Katholik. Er hat sicher die Idee des Gottes in sich, aber er war er war nicht so vertraut. Er war jemand, der darüber nachgedacht hat, der gesucht hat nach der Gottheit und nach dem katholischen Gott.
Very devoted to God, and there are a lot of little prayers in his private writings. And it slips out in a little court case with his nephew. His nephew's asked, does Beethoven ever pray with you? He says, yes, he prays with me twice a day to God. And we would never know this if it just hadn't happened to slip out in the court case. That every day, twice a day, Beethoven was praying to God.
Ich glaube, der Benediktus ist in vielen Messen oder Requiem der zentrale Punkt. weil das ist die Göttheit, die zu uns kommt. Und diese Benediktus von Beethoven kommt noch eine Überraschung hinzu, das ist der Heilige Geist. Und der Heilige Geist als Teil der Dreifaltigkeit kommt mit einer Violine zu uns. Wir kennen den Vater, wir kennen den Sohn. Mit dem Heiligen Geist können wir uns kaum etwas Konkretes vorstellen, weil es eben nicht konkret ist. Das ist etwas, was über alles schwebt. Und so ist die Violine in diese, wie dieser Teil geschrieben ist, schwebt über alles, schwebt über Solisten, schwebt über Chor, schwebt über Orchester. Also ich habe für Beethoven zwei Bilder. Das sind richtige Bilder. Ein großes Gehirn und ein ebenso großes Herz. Diese zwei Sachen kämpfen gegeneinander sehr oft. Aber sehr oft lieben sich auch. Es kommt so viel Liebe, so viel Mitgefühl, so viel Leidensfähigkeit und das kommt alles aus dem Herzen.
My income is practically nothing. My poor health has not allowed me to undertake professional tours, or avail myself of all the means by which a livelihood is made.
While writing the Missa Solemnis, Beethoven received an offer from London.
I am delighted to accept this offer to write a new symphony for the Philharmonic Society. If God would only restore my health, then I could comply with all the offers from throughout Europe and even of North America.
When he gets to this block of chords, ba-bum, 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 da-da-da, there is an urgency, an anxiety in this symphony, this anxious energy.
The Ninth Symphony begins in despair. He says, this is our despair, he writes in the margin of a sketch for the Ninth Symphony. And the second movement is no better. It's also terrifying. The hounds of hell are at your heels. The third movement is an image of something quite different, of love and beauty.
When I conduct this movement, I always imagine Beethoven, 53 years old, probably not so energetic or not so powerful. From some iconography, we now know Beethoven was not a big man, was not tall, was pretty small man. He probably was not with this kind of posture to be grand. Was a little bit more intimate, more fragile. more weak. And just saying that, okay, I wrote this most sincere confession about the love of the life he could write in music.
And you wonder how he's going to bring these things together, and he finally does it in the last movement with a simple tune which he spent weeks polishing to make it simpler and simpler and simpler, which is now the anthem of the European Union. He brings hope and salvation to the despair of the first movement.
I think one of the points of the Ninth Symphony is its monumentality, plain and simple. I don't think there had ever been a symphony, certainly, so massive as the Ninth, and for that reason alone, it makes a profound impression.
Nicht diese Töne, sondern lasst uns angenehme anstimmen und
very soon after that wonderful outburst, everything stops and you go, Seid umschlungen mir. You know, what is all this about? One sort of disjointed line with no harmony just after a massively joyous outburst. And this can only be puzzling and detract from the immediacy of the entire work's ability to communicate immediately with people who don't know Beethoven at all. So the Ninth Symphony's got wonderful moments, and some of the most universal moments in all Beethoven. But as a piece, it is, I hate to say flawed, because it's one of the most iconic, no, perhaps the most iconic piece of classical music there is. But I think it is flawed. It's perhaps inevitable it's flawed because it's so original, and that's why it's so great.
If the end of the Ninth Symphony is just, oh, happy end, we are all brothers, we love each other, I don't feel that in this music. From the very whisper in the shadow to this scream at the end of everybody, all the musicians, all the singers, sharing not this joy, but this espérance of joy, this dream of joy, this if only it could be like that.
As the symphony ended, Beethoven, standing near the wings, was turned to face the audience and was amazed. After 5 ovations, 2 more than the emperor traditionally received, the police stepped in to silence the crowd.
Baden, May 1825. Dear Dr. Braunhofer, I spit a good deal of blood. I have frequent nose bleedings. My stomach has become dreadfully weak. Dear Karl, to be constantly alone makes me only weaker. In any case, death with his scythe will not spare me much longer. Before my departure for the Elysian fields, I must leave behind me what the eternal spirit has infused into my soul and bids me complete. After all, only art and science gives us hopes of a higher life.
His deafness at this stage perhaps even helped him creatively, loosened all possible barriers of convention, practicability, accessibility, so that he could just follow his imagination wherever it took him.
The idea of this man was just beyond the possibilities considered possible at that time. So it's the imagination of Beethoven, probably because he was deaf. So he was disconnected in a way from the reality. Probably he went much more deeply inside himself. He tried to listen very carefully to his inner hearing, just to listen the very specific, deep voice that was singing inside himself.
I think the late quartets are amongst the most extraordinary creations of mankind. There's something in the emotion which has completely changed. And I don't know, I just have this personal feeling that there's some form of acceptance of life and just celebrating all aspects of life, including its pain and including its suffering, so that he was somehow able to accept that suffering as simply a part of life.
But that suffering intensified. In August 1826, Karl, endlessly bullied by Beethoven, tried to kill himself. Such horror took its toll.
Vienna, March the 6th, 1827. I cannot foresee the end of my dreadful illness. On the contrary, my sufferings and my anxieties have only increased. What am I to live on until I have recovered my lost strength and can again earn my living by means of my pen? Vienna, March the 10th, 1827. My health, which will not be restored for a very long time, demands that you should send me the wines I asked for. They will certainly bring me refreshment, invigoration, and good health.
Forever the optimist, and planning new works, including a 10th symphony. But Beethoven's body had simply had enough. On the 26th of March, 1827, age 56, Beethoven died. Thousands turned out to pay their last respects.
His repeated attempts to monumentalize, his repeated attempts to, outdo all of his contemporaries were clearly eminently successful. And so he became an intimidating figure. And in that sense, one part of Beethoven's legacy is to push people away from him, to push people in directions where they say, I can't do what Beethoven did, I'm not even going to try. See, that's the essential difference then, in a way, between Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart. Beethoven could say, I'm going to do what Haydn and Mozart did, and just as well. But people, in Beethoven's time didn't feel that they could compete. So that pushes kind of the creative act or the compositional act for many composers away from the Beethovenian model. The uniqueness of Beethoven and the attempt of composers, writers, critics, listeners afterwards to come to grips with this uniqueness inevitably gave rise to a re-evaluation of the past, the present, and future.